All right. Hey, everyone. Hello. Let's begin. Thank you for coming. So, if I give you a free ticket to a movie at the theaters, and I tell you it's a 3 hours long movie, and that is all you know about it, would anyone here go to this movie? Raise a hand if you would. Right. Some people. Right. Why not everyone? Well, the reason why not everyone is because we don't know if it's worth our time, right? What if I'm going to say that this is actually an official Marvel movie? Any more hands? Raise your hands. An official Marvel movie, a free ticket. Who would go? Right. More people. Many more people. Almost everyone, right? What happened? Why is it? What is the fact that this is a Marvel movie mattered for some of you? Well, that's because you know what you're going to get. You know you're going to laugh, get excited, enjoy the action, so on, right? So it's actually a matter of perceived value. Now, getting people to watch a 3 hour long movie at the theaters is hard. Arguably, it's not harder than getting people to start an EA fellowship, or watch an online course, or listen to a 3 hours long podcast episode. And while these are all high-fidelity ways for people to gain from the value that EA can give them, they also require a high amount of time and effort, and therefore require high perceived value for people to pursue them. So this obstacle of perceived value is not unique to EA. There is a field in marketing just for that called brand management, and let's see if we can bring some best practices from this field into community building. So a common advice that I was given when I started doing community building is to focus on my outcomes. And I think it's an important piece of the puzzle, but another important piece is, what do people want? And here is a messy slide with many things that EA can actually help with. Could be, how can my donations help the most? How do we measure the impact of a project? How can I compare career paths by impact? So then what was it with the movie? 3 things, right? Get excited, laugh, enjoy the action. But this puts us in a hard branding problem. So what can we do with that? So if we are to draw answers from the field of branding, we would want to divide our audience into different segments based on the value that each segment is seeking. Then the way that our organization, our community, our local group, would communicate with each segment would be based on the value that this specific segment is seeking. Another aspect of this parallel to branding is that branding usually sees the audience different than we do. They think of them as users or people who have to pay something. And in most groups, we don't ask for payment for the services and for participating in our activities. But actually, they do pay, our audience. They pay with their time. Think of how much time each of you had to pay to get to your level of EA proficiency. All of us are here, so probably we think there was a great return for this time. But if you want others to make this investment and to make this payment in time, they need to understand the return. Thinking of our audience as users also means that we're embracing that they have different preferences for what they will want to spend their times on, right? For individuals within the same segment of career advice, some would prefer listening to podcasts, some would prefer a workshop, some would prefer someone to consult with. So, what does this have to do with community building? You might have seen this before. This is the concentric circles model of community building by CEA, which divides a community into different levels of engagement. In this talk, I'd like to present 2 complementary models we use at EA Israel, which suggests different approaches for different levels of engagement. The first model is a user-centered model, which relates to the 3 outer circles. This model means viewing our audiences as users with a concrete problem or desire, and viewing a group as a service provider, offering services such as career advice, donation advice, tools, community, and so on. The second model is a volunteer-oriented model. It relates to the contributors and core circles and recommends looking at the community looking at members in this level of engagement as an exclusive group of volunteers. This model generally stresses the value of volunteering for the goal of community building and recommends prioritizing the onboarding and retention of volunteers. So I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes about each of these models and then offer concrete steps for testing them. And then we'll break into discussion groups. Now, these models have been extremely useful for me, for my experience. And I hope you'll find them useful as well. But just a short disclaimer about my epistemic status, I believe these models are generally useful for community building, but they're really based on my experience, as a biased experience as the director of EA Israel, and the experience of our board members. So they might have an even effect on your groups. A little bit of context about our group. We're a relatively young group, EA Israel, founded 3 years ago and funded only for the last 1.5 years. We have about 50 active volunteers, about the same number of members who are highly proficient in EA, and hundreds who participate in our activities, attending events, being active on social media, signed up for the newsletter, and so on. We've been specifically acknowledged so far for our high growth rate. The average growth of EA groups has been about 20% per year for the last years, while ours was 10 times higher for the first 2 years ago, twice as high 1 year ago, and 10 times higher last year. Instead of having a few activities, we have a whole lot of them. These are actually just the main out-facing ones. They include an official academic course, 2 fellowship programs, a large project named the Maximum Impact Program, which aims to get cost-effective considerations into the Israeli and Jewish philanthropic sectors. Besides that, 2 EA organizations that have started in Israel, as well as the Maximum Impact Program, received high amounts of funding from OpenPhil and FTX. This includes Probably Good, a career advice organization, and ALTA, a long-termist research center. So, let's begin with the user-centered model, which proposes framing the group as an organization that provides individuals with services. Here's a rough categorization of the needs that we can answer, divided into dilemmas, tools, and social. This is, by far, not a definitive list, because things here could be much more specific. Just as an example, the second bullet could be divided into dilemmas between career paths, which is probably like classic ATK, and it could be also divided into dilemmas about how I want to, how I can be the most impactful I can within an impactful role, say a policy-related role, and so on. It could even be more specific. We could try to answer the needs of people who are just interested in specifically the alternative protein fields. So that's about this mapping. Besides that, a group can try to prioritize these needs. For instance, if donations are not a comparative advantage for a group, you could focus on that less. You could focus much more on career paths that are specifically strong in your areas, and so on. So what would these needs actually mean for a group? So this model generally recommends that we build activities based on these needs. For instance, matching donation dilemmas with given what we can activity, matching career dilemmas with workshops, and matching entrepreneurship dilemmas with, say, networking events. And some activities, such as the networking event, should be associated with a value of more than one need, such as the social ones. When we look on activities this way, this framework helps us not only to understand how to shape the networking event to maximize the actual value it gives to participants, but also its perceived value, meaning that when I am trying to advertise the event, I want the title of the event, the description of the event, the groups for advertising, and so on, to be focused on the needs that I'm going to answer for the people who are going to attend. So when we shape all of these kind of things based on the needs, we are going to increase the perceived value of the event and therefore increase the motivation to arrive and to participate at the event. Being attentive to needs also means that sometimes you will want to create new activities. Here's an example that happened to us. In EA Israel, we've recognized that many newcomers who report us have a need for prioritizing volunteer opportunities. And they couldn't find any matching framework for that within EA. So what we did was to encourage a couple of volunteers to write an effective volunteering guide for two reasons. Well, of course, so it can help aspiring EAs prioritize volunteer opportunities based on impact. But also, so volunteering dilemmas can be one of the needs that we answer. And in this way, effective volunteering could serve as a possible entry point to EA for newcomers who are specifically interested in that need. Another important aspect of building activities based on needs is understanding the trade-off between the perceived value and the payment of time, and trying to respect the trade-off and the preferences of individuals along this trade-off. For example, in EA Israel, we're offering 3 different formats for discussion groups. The first is a classic semester-long fellowship. The second is a lighter, 4 meetings long intro crash course. And the third is even lighter, one-time discussion meetings that we brand with a light, catchy name, Talking Effectiveness. And what we do there is we don't even require people to read the materials in advance. Rather, we gradually expose them to the concept during the meetup. Now, this light Talking Effectiveness format is a very low barrier entry point to EA. And at least for us, it has been a very impactful way to get people to actually sign up for the 4 meetings long crash course. So I think this example shows 2 key aspects of the user model. The first is that it allows a gradual entry to EA. By letting members gradually understand the value that EA can give them, then gradually the perceived value is increased over time. The second is the value of having a wide variety of activities, each trying to fit different user preferences. At EA Israel, we deliberately try to have a wide variety of small activities rather than focusing on a few large activities. The main rationales for that are that we can get the low-hanging fruit of each segment, and 2, to get information value of what is the demand under each activity and under each segment. And this sort of strategy of having many small activities is much easier when you have many volunteers available, which is exactly what makes this model and the volunteer model that I'll soon discuss complement each other. There is yet another important reason for having a variety of activities: diversity. If a group focuses mostly on discussion groups, it will attract mostly the kind of individuals who see this as an activity they want to spend. As an activity that they want to spend their free time on. But not all promising EAs fall under this category, right? And in addition, some individuals are put off by social groups that are only centered around discussions. So this was all about shaping activities. Now let's talk a little bit about shaping the out-facing image of the group. And we can do this using a real story of a short story of a real member. Let's call him Will. Will heard about EA through his local group, and his friends framed EA as a place to get effective donation advice. He liked the idea, but he just wasn't interested since he was a penniless student. 3 years later, Will received a large inheritance and remembered that someone sometimes said something about donation advice, about EA in this context. So he approached his local group, and eventually he donated to Miri. What happened here? Will had his perception of EA tied to a queue of donation dilemmas. And what we can learn from this case is that when we are trying to pitch our group, design our website, advertise an event, and so on, we might want to focus on the things that we can offer, the concrete needs. So people will remember when to approach us in the future. This also means that we want to maximize the perceived value of what we offer, so people will think it's worth approaching us when they think of us, right? I got additional ideas specifically about pitching in a forum post called The Explanatory Obstacle of EA, which is linked to this presentation, along with some other resources that I'm going to discuss. You'll get a link to the presentation at the end. So, before we proceed to the next model, I'd like to ask, is volunteering a service that EA groups provide? Well, some people actively seek a volunteer opportunity, or just feel strongly connected to EA and just kind of want to help somehow. And it is something that we can offer. So this brings us to the second model, the volunteer-oriented model. This model views volunteering as both a need and a service, and emphasizes the significantly high value of volunteering. So what's so valuable about volunteering? Two things. First is obvious: resources. The more available hands your team has, the more your team can do. The second value of volunteering is less trivial, and is that it can serve as an entry point to EA. So while members volunteer, they can gradually learn what's the value that EA can give them. So at EA Israel, we are 100% open and explicit about this. We actually tell our volunteers that the coolest project requires strong understanding of EA, and we even talk about specific projects that might interest specifically them. But then we offer simpler projects to start with, while simultaneously learning about EA. So we're just really open about this point with our volunteers. Okay. One of the ways to empower volunteering as an entry point is to have an exclusive group of contributors. At EA Israel, we define a contributor as anyone who volunteers at EA Israel or contributes to the global movement. We call this group EA Israel activists, which is a framing that carries some motivational effect and also helps separate this group from people who don't volunteer but are still strong aspiring EAs. Because anyone can be part of a movement even if they don't volunteer, right? What do I mean by that? A symptom of having an exclusive activist group is that we end up investing more in people who contribute directly to the movement. But we don't want newcomers to feel pressure to volunteer. And if a newcomer ends up planning an impact-oriented career or starts donating regularly to effective charities, even if they don't volunteer, they still should feel a part of the movement, and we have done our part, and everyone should be happy. So for this reason, at EA Israel, we're splitting the participant circle into two. We define participants as basically anyone who requested one of our services. We virtually have only one contact form where individuals can multi-select requests such as joining a crash course, a discussion group, asking for a career 101, donation 101, and more. So anyone who fills out this form is for us a participant. Then we define highly involved participants as members who are aligned with EA thinking but just don't volunteer. And we try to invest in those as much as we invest in volunteers. And I think that's an important nuance, because eventually what we care about in community building is shifting social action decisions to higher impact opportunities. And for this source of impact, highly involved participants are as valuable as volunteers. Yet, volunteering entails some indirect added values, as I've discussed before. And so the extent to which I want to nudge new people towards volunteering just depends on how big are these added values. And a tricky thing is that these added values changes over the lifetime of a group. Here are the two main sources for that. First is the value of volunteering for small groups is arguably much higher, because the marginal value of every community building effort is higher, and also it's a very attractive entry point to the group, since volunteers get an ownership for something that is new. Second thing that changes over time is that the bottleneck of a group changes as it grows. So when I entered my role at EA Israel, our bottleneck was members who are highly proficient in EA. But 6 months later, our bottleneck became too many requests from newcomers who wanted to participate in our activities, which made us strongly focus on recruiting new volunteers. Then, a few months later, we still focused on volunteers, but rather than recruiting, we focused more on volunteer management and optimizing the time of our strong volunteers. So what I'm trying to say here is that the bottlenecks of a group changes pretty often, and this changes the value of volunteering for the group. Similar to our discussion on how services should fit individual needs, here again, it's extremely valuable to offer a wide variety of volunteer projects. And here again, the benefits are fitting individual motivation, right? Fitting the motivation of different people to be motivated for different volunteer opportunities, and also diversity for the very same reasons. So, we have discussed the value of volunteering, but what are the costs? So, volunteer management is arguably more complex than employee management. It includes all the same practices of management, but then just adds lots of complexities and things we have to deal with, such as high turnover due to low commitment and lesser quality regarding project management of EA content, and just requires an investment in volunteer onboarding. I think that the cost of managing those is overshadowed by the value of volunteering, as we described earlier. But that is given that you know how to deal with these complexities. So I won't go over this now, but I've included EA Israel's best practices for dealing with those to the presentation for those of you who would like to view it afterwards. So, if you're interested in those best practices or in other resources that I've mentioned earlier in the talk, I'll soon provide a QR code linking to this presentation, where you will also find a slide with all the links and resources I've mentioned, slides with ways to test whether these models are actually useful for your specific groups, and hidden slides with additional secret tips.